Hey, Wolverines. Welcome back to the Wolverine Buzz podcast. This is our continuing coverage of the U.S. Senate election here in the state of Utah. And we have another special guest here with us today, Mr. Brent Orrin Hatch. Sir, thank you so much for being here today.
It's great to be here.
Absolutely. Well, sir, do you want to go ahead and introduce yourself?
Well, I'm a lawyer. I've practiced here in Salt Lake for a number of years, where I've represented individuals and large companies. And usually for the companies, it's like a make the company or break the company type of case. Usually with the individuals, it's a case that is of extreme importance in their life. Sometimes, protecting their rights, sometimes their constitutional rights. And so I've been doing that for a number of years now. Have a long background in the government. I'm sure you'll ask me about that as well.
Oh, absolutely. As a matter of fact, when I was doing research for this, from what I understand, you used to be the treasurer for the Federalist Society. Was that correct?
Not used to be. I've been a member of the board of directors and a treasurer for the Federalist Society for about 36 years. I go back far enough with the Federalist Society that I'm with the group of what were law students who started the institution back when people were at Yale, Columbia, Chicago, and Harvard, I believe. And it was just a few of us. And we were able to, with a few $1,000s and a few law professors that were willing to help us out. And over the years, we were able to build the organization into probably the largest and most prestigious conservative group of lawyers and law students in the entire country.
Absolutely. And I find that so fascinating, too, because I was also reading you were also a law clerk for Robert Bork.
And he was one of the original advisors of the Federalist Society and remained so for a long, long period of time, as was Justice Scalia was one of the original judges that helped. He was on the Court of Appeals in the District of Columbia at the time. He had also been a law professor, and Judge Bork had also been a law professor at Yale.
Absolutely. I can't wait to get into the courts with you, because that's something I do want to talk with you about today. But let's just jump right into the campaign. I always like to ask because we've interviewed several Senate candidates who are vying for the same office you are.
There's 11 of us on this one.
11, yeah.
There's no shortage of candidates.
Oh, absolutely. And so that's why I want to sort of dive deep into when it comes to what a Senator Hatch, right? I mean, your father was senator here for almost 42 years, and we'll get into that as well. But the one thing I always like to ask a congressional candidate is when it comes to policy. I mean, you know this very well with the family. I mean, when you get elected to the Senate, you have 99 other colleagues, right? And, of course, everything has to pass both houses of Congress. So you have 435 colleagues in the House who are always diverse when it comes to their opinions. So my question to you is this. When it comes to getting legislation done and passed, beyond the rhetoric, what is your plan to pass legislation? What's the key to working with your colleagues?
Well, first, I would tell you, when you look at all the candidates, look at what they're promising you, okay? I've been around for a few years, and some of the candidates do, they thread red meat out, and they say things like, I'm going to abolish the Department of Education. I've been hearing that my whole life. And as you well know, I believe you're a political science major, is that correct?
Yes, sir. You assume correctly.
Okay. Well, you would know that one senator or one congressman is not going to abolish a department inside the federal government. And so someone tells you that, they're just trying to throw you red meat. The reality is, to make things change in the government, it's a mammoth. It takes a lot to move it around. And so you have to be able to, understand the system, how it works, and be able to work within that to get agreements to move things. Now, you've talked about two things. One is, how do you do that as a single senator or a single congressman? And the best thing you can do is, in my view, is be friends with people. Now, the second thing is, you never stray from your core principles. I learned that partly from my father and partly from when I went to law school. With my father, he was a good conservative, but by the end of his career, he had passed more legislation than any other senator that basically had ever lived. And part of that was because he was able to reach across the aisle while still keeping his core foundational principles. when I went to law school at Columbia University in New York. And when I got there, I found out pretty quick that it was a pretty liberal place to be. And I wasn't that. I was a conservative. And so I could have, as a matter of fact, a funny story, it's troubling if you think about it. My first day of law school, I went in, and down the main hall was where all the various clubs had their boards. And I come into my first day of law school, and there's a board with a picture of my father on it. And I go, well, that usually would be kind of nice, except for this one had rings drawn around his head like a dartboard and a dart stuck in the center of his head. That was my introduction to law school. So I could have just been vindictive or frustrated or anything that was negative, but what I chose to do was continue to be myself, but to be able to make friends as much as I could. So as you can imagine, at a school like that, we did a lot of debating of the issues. The hallways were always rife with that. But by the time I left the place, I hadn't changed. I changed a few people on the other side, but I left with a lot of friends. And I think my father taught me that, and I think that's kind of a key. If you want to be able to move things, you can't be enemies with people who don't believe the same thing you do. You're never going to find common ground that way.
Absolutely. And do you think there's a lot of that currently in our political rhetoric? I mean, a lot of people saying, oh, well, you don't talk to them because they're the enemy. They're the ones who are causing our problems, so you shouldn't ever negotiate. What would you say to that?
Well, the system fosters that, frankly. A lot of that is because people are trying to get press. They're trying to, it's money in politics. You have to raise money, and the easiest way to do that is to be strident. But it's also, I would say it's also a little bit because most of them have been there too long. So when people start doing that, quite often they're doing it because they're trying to further their own career, their own celebrity, those types of things. I've often said if I were king for a day, which none of us are going to get to be, but, if you were, I would probably limit senators to 1 term and congressmen to 2 terms, so that they'd be more answerable to the state that they come from. They know they were going to be going back home, and it wasn't going to be making D.C. a career for them.
So you would be 4 term limits then?
Oh, yeah. I used to be, when I was a political science major like you, I always bought into senators 2 terms and congressmen like 6 or 8 terms. I become a little bit more strident about it. I think I would do, seriously, 1 term for a senator, and then
so
go
like
home.
Just 6 years for that.
That's it, yeah.
So maybe I could follow up this with what you were saying about your dad. When it comes to, I guess, right now, a lot of folks are seeing Brent Orrin Hatch, right? They see you. They see your family's legacy. Right. What are some of the things that you're doing to maybe differentiate yourself from your father? Are you trying to continue your father's legacy? And as we were mentioning before, your father served for 42 years in the Senate. He did. And so with those term limits, is that something you would want to apply to, say, if you were elected a senator to yourself, or continuously try to get term limits?
Well, that's why I said if I were king for the day, and it would apply to everybody, because as you know, as a political science major, the Senate is a body that rewards longevity, and that was the system my father grew up in and operated under. I'm actually very proud of what he was able to do, because even when I was there, he never got caught up into being in D.C. and the whole the game back there. He took very seriously what he was doing for the citizens of Utah. And it's one of the things I noticed the most being on the campaign trail, because no matter where I'm in Utah, I mean, it can be in the far corners of the state, I have people come up to me and tell me stories about what my father did for their family. He spent a lot of time doing that. And we have some of our politicians now won't go to the rural communities. They don't want to be bothered because they want to be, they like the D.C. life. And we should never have people in office that don't want to represent the state and don't want to be part of the state and don't expect to come back and live as residents in their neighborhood. And my father really, he was really good at that. And I think he viewed his time there as a calling, and he approached it that way every day.
Absolutely. Let's jump into some campaign issues then. When it comes current event right now, the speaker, we're all trying to negotiate a bill for the budget. The budget's been a very big issue during this campaign. I think
I think they're calling it the minibus, right?
The minibus,
the
exactly.
Minibus.
I mean, it's something that
it's
every
like 400.
talked about.
Yeah, it's a minibus. I think partly because it's not a full budget, but it's going to be putting up you'll probably correct me, but $435 billion, I believe it is, and there's a bunch of earmarks and off-record items that would add them another $70 billion or so. So we're talking about $500 billion.
Oh yeah.
And so, and again, it's like almost every time we get to that type of a piece of legislation, it's thousands and thousands of pages that nobody's going to ever read. We don't really know what's in it, and quite often it's an amount of money that nobody can afford, that we don't have the money for. We're going to borrow for. And as you know, and I'm sure it was probably on your list of questions asked, I mean, I was reading, I think it was The Economist magazine in December when the national debt was $32 trillion. Mm-hmm. And then as soon as I announced my run for the Senate, a week or two later, it was $34 trillion. Mm-hmm. And I go, well, when did it become like $1 trillion were pocket change?
Oh, yeah.
And now there was an article last week that said we're going up $1 trillion every 100 days. We don't have that. We're borrowing money. We're borrowing money from other countries. Some of those countries are ones that we have some strained relationships with.
Yeah, and China's a stakeholder in that.
So it starts getting into talking about inflation. It talks about our cost of living. It talks about whether young men like you are going to have jobs. It talks right to our foreign policy, the wars that we're getting in. Every bit of that has become problematic, and a lot of that deficit in the national debt is due to people making decisions 5-10 years ago. And we need to start making the right decisions now, or we're going to be in a place where we can't. It's going to destroy our economy and everything we've got going. The deficit, which is of course different than the debt, the deficit in servicing the national debt, in other words, paying the interest on that, there are reports now that that's risen to be as big as almost as big now, or as big as the military budget. Now think about that. If we would have thought about the borrowing we were doing 10 years ago and realized we'd be at that place and we'd be starting to even risk our military readiness
on the budget right now.
No, it's crazy. And so, every candidate I think in our race is talking about the national debt, and the question is,
where do you start to cut?
Where are you going to cut? And when I was a young man, there were issues like this, and I bet you could still find this on the internet. It would give you the whole national budget, and say, okay, here it is, and you could actually do your own cutting and see what would you cut to get there. Mm-hmm. And it's not an easy thing.
Because especially when it comes to the interest that build around some of these things that are on the budget.
Sure.
You go for anything like, let's just take the military. There's a great interest in keeping the budget where it's at. You go for social programs, there's great interest there. So when it comes
a lot of them are entitlements too. If you go to the tool that lets you try to play king for the day and say where would you cut, I'm telling you right now, it would be very, very difficult for you to do that.
So say that a budget bill comes to the Senate and a Senator Hatch takes a look at that. Where would Senator Hatch cut?
Well, I'm going to look at every bill with the eye to, if it was my personal budget, can I afford this? All right, and that's the problem. They haven't had a budget or passed a budget in how many years now? Over a decade, something like that. It's crazy.
Right. Never on time, right?
Well, yeah, and so that's why we hear every depending on how long they kick the can down the road, we have them talking about, the government's going to shut down because we're out of borrowing authority, right? And then it becomes this kind of standoff to see who's going to give in first. And the press and the Democrats tell the Republicans, you're going to destroy the economy if you don't let us borrow more money. And the Republicans, because particularly the conservative Republicans, are saying we can't afford this. And people try to vilify the Republicans because they say that. I think Mike Lee said it best when I think he said it's not right wing to say we can't afford this, because we can't. And so I think you have to look at every bill, and every time they increase the budget and want to spend more money, you have to say, can we afford this? You'd do that if it was your own personal budget. I mean, most of us don't have the option of just saying, I'm just going to keep borrowing and living a lifestyle I can't afford. And it's very troubling when it starts to impact things like the military budget when we're involved, at least financially, in 2 wars. In the prior administration, we didn't even have that. And now we've got China pressing us from the West. We're in Israel. We're helping a great ally there, and we're helping Ukraine, and we're borrowing money to do that. And so, we need to be a little more fiscally responsible, and I think that's one of the key things that I will focus on and would bring to the race.
Do you think that here in America we might be addicted to deficit spending?
Is that a statement or a question?
Well,
because I think it's pretty obvious we are, right?
Because that's the thing I always like to investigate. Because sometimes we get so used to spending at that kind of level that, if we were to cut someplace, where is someone going to feel it now so that we can benefit later?
Well, I'll give you an example. You didn't get into my early background, but when I actually worked in the White House once, and I remember
President Reagan's administration. Right?
I worked in President Reagan's administration in the Justice Department, and then later I was Associate White House Counsel under President George H.W. Bush. And there are times where we met with the Office of Management and Budget and others, and one of my colleagues reminded me of an instance where one of the departments had come with a new program that was going to cost billions of dollars, and it was going to be super effective, and it was going to allegedly save money and do all this stuff, but they needed huge funding for it. And there was another program that did similar things, and so someone in the meeting raised, well, okay, then we can get the money by cutting this other program that you just said wasn't as effective, and you need this new program. And the bureaucrat looked him in the face and said, we can't do that. And the woman said, why not? And they said, well, it would be immoral to cut that out. Well, with common sense, she was speaking common sense, because she was saying, if you're going to replace one program with another, essentially, and it's going to be more effective, and it's going to do all these other things, then it's pretty easy. You can pay for it by eliminating the past program. But that's not the way people think in Washington. They just keep adding on top of on top and on top until pretty soon it's out of control.
And then you have interest being the second biggest budget item, right?
Well, that's where it is. That's where we find ourselves now. And the national debt is now. If it's going up $1 trillion every 100 days, we're probably pretty close to having the national debt be as big as the entire gross domestic product of the country.
Yeah, because I remember when I was in high school, my first article I ever published in the newspaper there was about when the debt passed 20 trillion, right? And it's been just about 5 years since then. I graduated in 2020. Okay. And so I was a COVID kid. Fair enough. But, I see that so often nowadays, especially, and I think a lot of our listeners will see the debt, being young people, and they'll be like, well, heck, what is it going to be like when my kids are born?
Well, and think about it this way. If our predecessors had been a little bit more responsible, and we actually could afford that money, think about it. Something the size of the military budget, we're paying an interest to other countries, okay? If you had that money and you could spend it on things that actually would improve the country, maybe make us a safer, maybe on the border, which apparently could use a lot of that, we'd be able to do a lot of things, and instead we're just paying interest to other countries. And that's the problem with a lot of politicians, is they don't really think in the long term. They just think for the moment. And that's why when you get to a point where we start hitting the borrowing level, that's all they can think about. And no one's thinking, okay, why can't we put something in place that's going to be, last for 5 years or 10 years, or think down the road a little bit? You mentioned, we began by talking a little bit about the Federalist Society. I understand that, and part of it's because of what we did with the Federalist Society. What the problem was when we were law students, we realized there were almost no conservative law professors. And so your legal education wasn't particularly diverse. It was all in one direction, to the left. And most judges at that time felt like they could just do whatever they wanted. And we always called that as they were acting like they were a legislature. Each judge was his own little legislature. And so we worked with academics and other lawyers to take the long-term approach and say, all right, what can we do with this? And we started writing papers about that a judge is supposed to interpret the law, not make law. And over the course of the next 20, 30 years, all of a sudden people who are coming up in their nominations to be judges, even liberal judges, were saying, oh yeah, the proper role of a judge is to interpret the law. In other words, call balls and strikes, not to make law. Make laws for the legislative branch. And it took us 20, 30 years before we got people talking with the right frame of mind, because we thought ahead. And I worked on almost every Supreme Court nomination under President Reagan, President Bush the first, President Bush his son, and President Trump. And that's a lot of years. But we ended up with a Supreme Court that now, if you look at it in political eyes, it's a 6-3 court that stands for the rule of law.
Right.
I wasn't sure I'd ever see that in my lifetime, but that took a while to do.
It was a lot of work, yeah.
Yeah, and I think legislators, like most businessmen who have to plan for the future, need to look with a pair of glasses on that see the future. And now they just look for what's going to get them sound bites at the end of the day.
And I feel like it's a great transition to my next topic that I wanted to speak
Oh,
with you on.
good.
When it comes to the court.
Okay.
And so, you're running for the Senate. You'd be involved with Senate nominations and Senate approval for justices of the Supreme Court. As we were mentioning earlier, you worked with Robert Bork, and Bork famously was borked.
Yes,
and
he
so
was.
When it comes to...
Well, he wasn't borked at the time because the word hadn't been invented yet, right?
He completely invented it, but he was the one who it was coined after,
Yeah,
right?
Exactly.
So let me ask you a little bit about that. With the way the nomination process has become, it's always very divisive. You saw that with Brett Kavanaugh. You saw that with Amy Coney Barrett. You even saw it with Neil Gorsuch when he was put on the court under President Trump. And so the way the nomination process is, do you think that process has become less bipartisan since it's as the years have gone by? Or do you think that maybe it'd be something different?
Well, I think the nomination of Judge Bork to be on the Supreme Court was a real turning point for the country. I remember some of the just awful things they accused him of and that they did to him. I don't know if you're aware of this, but they actually went through his trash. And they were hoping to find something bad. And back when you used to go to Blockbuster to actually get a hard copy of a movie, they found his Blockbuster rental, and they were so disappointed because all of the movies he were getting were like old classics and war movies. And they were hoping they'd get some dirt on him, right?
Right.
But they really vilified him, and a lot of people think that was the turning point where civility went out the window. And you could make a good academic case for that. And how we get that back, because it seems to be a one-way ratchet, it just seems to get worse and worse and worse and worse with no way to get back to round one. And that's a really tough question. But I think it's part of it's a responsibility on each of us to make sure that we pick people to represent us, and particularly in the Senate, which is the body that determines whether to pass nominations through, that people are, mature enough. They're not so self-centered that they're looking just to make a big splash for themselves and become a celebrity, but they take their job fairly serious. And I think that's one of the things I would add here, because I'm at a point in my life where, I want to be able to go back and represent the state because I think I can do it well. I think I have the maturity and the experience that really none of the other candidates have. None of the other candidates have worked in the White House. None of them have worked in the executive branch or the judicial branch. and I bring a perspective that I think the others don't have.
Absolutely. And so when it comes to, I guess, with the different nomination process that we'll see in the future, I mean, of course, right after Bork, we had Clarence Thomas, and that was pretty gnarly as well. I just find it cool because you've witnessed these things, and I've read about them in history
I
books.
worked on most of them.
And so that's what I find cool about it. And so, sorry if I'm acting like...
No, that's fine. That's fine. I've rarely had anybody think what I did was cool, but yeah, so I appreciate that.
Poli-sci major, my friend.
There you go. There you go.
And so I guess my next question, at least about when it comes to court nominations, would be this. At least when going forward, as we've mentioned, I mean, we need to be looking at the people who are running for the Senate, going into the Senate. Do you think as well that in terms of where our polarized politics are, do you think that also is playing a role in it, especially when it comes to the lifetime appointment of a Supreme Court justice?
I'm not 100% sure what you're talking about, but if you're whether or not them having a lifetime appointment adds to the polarization because the risks are, I mean, the stakes are higher.
Stakes are higher when it comes to a lifetime appointment. And so when we're having a polarized society, do you think that do you think it's a lot harder it is now to get to the point we were speaking of before than when it was? So like back when, I mean, as this process has begun to be polarized, do you think that it's a lot harder to get to the point where it'd be more civil?
I think it is. I've seen a lot of proposals, some of which, there are lifetime appointments, and it's part of the Constitution, so you would have to change the Constitution with an amendment to change that. But there is, I mean, I could see a proposal could be somewhat rational if it was say you could only, you have a full appointment, but until some certain age, and given what we're seeing with the decline in capacity due to age to some of our politicians now, that happens with judges too. And those kind of things could potentially be a productive change, and would make the risk a little less. I mean, when I was on the Court of Appeals with Judge Bork, and I won't give names, but there was a judge that really wasn't all there, but because one party controlled the Senate and the White House, they didn't want him to step down because they wanted someone in his party to replace him. So they were just literally nurturing him along to try to hold it out, and that's just wrong. Mm-hmm. And so when we have those kind of motivations built into the system, it seems like there probably is, we're due for a change. And you see that particularly with Supreme Court justices. I think I saw an article today that the Democrats are trying to get Ketanji Brown, I think it is, no, not Ketanji, it's Sotomayor to step down because she's 70 years old. Mm-hmm. And they're worried that Trump is going to win and they may not have a chance to replace her, in the near or distant future.
Just like with Justice, oh my gosh, I'm blanking here.
Gorsuch.
Not Gorsuch. Amy Coney Barrett replaced her. Ruth Bader Ginsburg.
Yeah,
it was like with Justice Ginsburg.
Sure, the Democrats were furious. I knew Judge Ginsburg. She was on the Court of Appeals when I clerked there, and I got to know her fairly well. Wonderful person. She also was affiliated with Columbia Law School, where I went to law school. But she got heavily criticized by people in the Democratic Party that she didn't do the politically expedient thing and retire earlier than she did, so that they could have replaced her instead of Amy Coney Barrett getting that seat. So, those things are, when those kind of things happen, the court becomes a lot more politicized, and that has a negative influence on our institutions, which is sad. So we could make changes, sure. And
I think that's where I'm interested in terms of the institutions bit of it, because I feel like there's a lot of, take Trump v. Anderson, the case that was just handed down by the Supreme Court here recently. It seems as though if the court were to rule either way, they have one side who is like, oh, well, of course they're going to rule our way, and if they don't, then they're wrong. Then over here you got the same people saying the same thing. There seems to be a lot of political pressure when it comes to the body that's meant to be judicially independent. And so do you think that that's a threat to the court?
But when people talk about people being nasty and all these things, if you're a political science major, if you add to that being at least partially a history major, you would know that political races and politics has been dirty for a long time, in the sense that people accuse people of things that really don't exist, and they do whatever they have to do to be able to maintain power or to gain power. So, I take an approach to this that realizes that I don't know that it's any worse now than it has been in the past. It just seems that way because we're living it. But the Supreme Court, in particular, that's a tough thing to do, and I was very proud of them in the recent decision because it wasn't a tough call. I mean, it was very clear that certain states were trying to fiddle with the presidential election, and those states should be able to do that, and that's why it was a 9-0 decision. Now, there was some dissension as to how far that should go for future reference, but I think it was very clear to everybody who was even remotely reasonable that states shouldn't be able to do that, and it was as a matter of constitutional law and as a matter of just common sense and morality. So I wasn't surprised by that at all. I had predicted that, and I think it was right. But that's tough because the court, as you saw the paper, there were people who didn't like the decision and claimed it was political. And it's real hard to say, given the breakdown of that court, it's really hard to say that's political when it's 9-0.
Right. And take another case like with Dobbs v. Jackson. The decision was leaked beforehand, and we saw the backlash. So you had people going to justices' homes protesting out on the side of them. I mean, especially with that kind of political nature around the courts, I mean, is there a line where it's going too far in terms of, not with the court sense, but at least the political nature that we have around it?
I don't think that's political. I think that's illegal and criminal behavior, frankly. You shouldn't be threatening anybody, and particularly, they're threatening the lives and the families of Supreme Court justices. That should not be tolerated. And I don't think, particularly the Biden administration was as strong as they probably should have been. That should be something we should all be able to coalesce around, and everybody be for, is that type of behavior just is not to be tolerated. I've met and I've worked on the nominations of many of the judges that are on the court now. Afterwards, I'll show you some pictures if you want.
Absolutely.
But we these are on both sides of the aisle. They're smart people, well qualified, and I don't think there's a single one that doesn't take their job seriously. They may differ ideologically and even the approach that they take to the Constitution, but that doesn't mean they're stupid. It doesn't mean that they're vindictive or that there's something untowards about what they do. And so we should be excited when we have an issue that looks like it's going to be a complicated political issue, and they're able to find a 9-0 result of that. It's a great thing.
Absolutely. Let's jump into our next topic. I wanted to you mentioned here earlier about how you don't think a lot of folks are reaching out to the rural communities here in Utah.
I think it's horrible. I mean, we have sitting people, I won't name names, but literally won't go.
If you choose to, I won't stop you.
Well, I get it, but I'm here to run a positive campaign. I'm running for office. I think I'm the best candidate for the office, and I don't think I need to tear anybody down to do that.
Power to you.
But there are plenty of people who, particularly in our rural communities, really don't see any interest in that. And there are serious issues. Our rural communities, I mean, if you go up in Vernal, it's kind of like the center for energy. And a lot of bustling activity up there, and sometimes it's a boom and sometimes it's a bust there. But we should care about that. I care about it even more because Vernal was settled by my ancestors. It was actually at one time called Hatchtown, and Jeremiah Hatch settled it.
Right.
And that's I was up there just last week, and I think we decided that was my great-great-great-grandfather. But
that's incredible.
Don't hold me to the number of greats. But it seems like I'm related to half the town up there.
Absolutely.
But one of those relatives went down and was the Mormon bishop of Moab for like 36 years, I was told. And I go to Moab a lot. I go down to a lot of these towns. this is one way I'm different than my father, is I actually go jeeping and hiking and mountain biking, and I think one of the greatest things we have for this state, and I've brought back congressmen, friends that have been congressmen and have had served in the military and other high level positions, and I'll bring them back and they're shocked because I can take them up in the mountains in the north, and then we can go down to the moonscape in the south.
The state's a gorgeous state.
It's just unbelievable, and it blows their mind. I mean, especially when you drive down there and you can go for an hour and not see a building, and you don't get that in the East. But I love our rural areas. We were just down in Richfield. We had a great time. I go down there all the time. Like I said, I spent a lot of time in Moab. I've gone Comb Ridge. I've gone into a lot of the rural area. I mean, not just rural. I mean, I get back into the wilderness sometimes, and where you can find Indian relics and other things, and it's otherworldly. And I have a pretty high pressure job as a trial lawyer, and for me it's like a way to just shed all the pressure, shed all the stress, and just marvel at what we have.
And just take a breath of God's beauty, right?
It really is, and if you haven't done it, you should.
Absolutely. And so going forward with that, I want to talk to you a little bit about like public lands and President Biden's use of the Antiquities Act. I mean, not too recently, but Bears Ears was expanded. And of course, down in Arizona, there was a massive increase in the monument that was made around the Grand Canyon, which made a lot of rural ranchers, not really happy. And so when it comes to the Antiquities Act and it comes to the public lands, is there a way that you would want them to be used that is currently not what the policy is? Would you make a change to the policy? How would Senator Hatch identify that?
These are really highly charged issues, and quite often the people who are taking the positions that President Biden has been pushing, and President Obama did the same thing, they're usually Eastern, I got to use some political terms, they're Eastern liberals who really haven't been back here like I have, and hopefully you have, and enjoyed the state. And they don't understand the rural lifestyle, they don't understand farmers, they don't understand even miners and how that works. My experience is the people there are usually the best stewards of the land and know how it is. They don't want where they live to be ugly. They don't want it to be treated poorly. A lot of the lands are Indian tribal lands, and they're certainly great stewards of the land. And I think the people who live there have a right to have a major say in how the lands near them are treated. We're constantly being put upon by people outside our state because I can never remember what the exact figure is, but around 90% of the land in Utah is not private.
Right. It's public. It's federal.
It's public, and that requires multiple uses. I'll give an example. I mean, I like going out and on the Red Rock on either on a side by side or sometimes hiking. And you'll have people who don't do that who will just, they'll just scream about, oh, you're destroying these trails. Well, I have trails that I've been doing for over 30 years, and I've never seen any degradation in the trail except for one thing. A huge rainstorm comes through, and Mother Nature wreaks havoc on the trail. And I've seen rainstorms that have caused more damage to a trail than 15 years of Jeeps going across it. But people who don't actually participate in those kind of activities, they're dealing in theory. They're not dealing in real life.
Right.
And enjoying the outdoors is, it's really, we live in a state where we really emphasize and care about family and togetherness and and activities that bring us closer together, not as families but also as communities. And I think Utahns would tell you one of the things that they can do in this state that are great family activities and great unifying activities and doesn't cost a lot because it's generally free, is getting out in the outdoors, camping in the mountains, mountain biking and ATVing in the south, running the rivers, doing the kind of things that our state really sells itself to the rest of the world for. And almost everywhere I go, particularly I go to Arches if you haven't, and just count how many languages you get that you hear being spoken. There's people from Germany, from France, all over the world that come to see what we've got. And I don't know anybody who's trying to destroy it. And so we shouldn't vilify people who take their families and enjoy what our state has to offer.
Absolutely. Let's. I want to be respectful of your time. Let's talk a little bit about the campaign. Right now, like you said at the beginning, we've got 11 candidates in there. Everyone's trying to make their case of why they're the best candidate to be in there. Matter of fact, just last night, this is why I'm in a hat today, y'all. The caucus just happened. Sure. Delegates have been selected. They're going to be going to the state convention here on April 27th, knowing that there might be also a primary as well. What would you say to voters? What would you say to delegates who are going to the convention? What would you say to them on why you would be the best pick to be the Republican nominee?
Well, I think what I would look at if I were one of the delegates is I'd look at the candidates and say, all right, who's going to best represent me? But also, who is the person who is going to represent me and doesn't really need this job? They're not doing it because for self-glory or just because it's the next step on the rung up the ladder. I started my life, as I told you at the beginning, working for Judge Bork when I came right out of law school. He then told me, look, Ronald Reagan was the first conservative president in his lifetime. And he said, you'll have plenty of time to be a lawyer. You need to go serve in the administration of Ronald Reagan, which I did with great honor. Now, you're a political science major. I guess I should ask you, do you remember what his campaign slogan was in 1980?
1980, Ronald Reagan's? Make America Great Again.
Let's make America great again. So it had one different word.
Yeah, there's one little difference there.
And people said the world was going to come to an end if he got elected. And now, of course, with time, we realize that the Berlin Wall came down, taxes got cut. He was one of the great, dignified, great presidents we ever had. I represented him personally and then Vice President Bush in the Iran-Contra trial, which was some significance.
Absolutely,
and, it was pretty famous. So when I got when President Bush won the presidency, he asked that I come be counsel in the White House. And so I had that opportunity to go to the White House. And so I have all those experiences. And then we've talked a lot about the Federalist Society. But I was kind of asked to stay in D.C., continue to take political jobs. I could have made a great career for myself there. But my wife and I made a decision that we didn't want to raise our children there. Mm-hmm. We didn't think it was a great place to raise children, and we knew Utah would be. And so we came back here, raised all of our children here. We're now helping raise our grandchildren here. And I've spent the last 30 years as a hard-fighting trial lawyer, and I think if you do your research, you'll see that I've handled most of the biggest cases that have been ever handled in the state of Utah. But I'm at a point in my career now, with my children grown, and we're on to grandchildren now, that I can actually give back. And I don't have to, if this doesn't happen, my life goes on. I have a pretty good life. People think I'm kind of crazy because, I could be spending more time in southern Utah hiking and running rivers.
Right.
So I don't bring to it some kind of personal need for myself to do this. I bring it because I have, as you can see throughout my whole life, a strong belief in our constitutional system and the need to have people who can be strong conservatives but also get along with other people and bring some sanity and common sense to not just representing our state but to nationally to get things done. And we've got, with our border and with the national debt and everything else, we got some serious problems that take some maturity to deal with, and I think I can add that.
Absolutely. Well, Mr. Hatch, I want to say thank you so much for coming on the show. I want to give you a quick, some time just to plug anything you want. We have 44,000 students on campus who are most likely registered voters, right? And so I just wanted to give you, we hope so, exactly.
Well, I mean, everybody here on campus ought to be just thrilled that this institution exists. I mean, it's in a short period of time. When I went to Columbia, I can't remember when that school started, but like the 1600s or something. And you guys, in a short time, this is a major university. You have great sports teams, but you have a great opportunity for education here.
Great newspaper too, right?
And a great newspaper, and well, actually,
that wasn't a shameless plug. All right, there you go.
It was pretty shameless, but I will say this: you've done a phenomenal job with this interview, and I hope everybody takes their education here serious, because you really are our future. I mean, you're not very far off. I don't know how old you are. But when I was working in the Reagan administration in the Bush White House, I was in my 20s. And I look back at that and go, that's almost insane. Because there was so much I didn't know. I thought I knew everything. But we did know a lot. And we brought enthusiasm, we brought smarts, and we had the ability to actually change policy and make a difference. And every person who's listening to this, if you're listening to this, you probably care about these things. You can make a difference in your community, both politically, but in business, in your church obligations. You really have the world open to you, and that's my goal for what I would do as a senator as well, is make sure those opportunities remain. I want those for my children. I want those for my grandchildren. I don't want you to be so mired in debt that the economy is in a crapper, and we're everybody's looking to the government to just take care of them, and we end up in a Marxist society. We've seen other countries go down that road, and it's not pretty. We live in the greatest country in the world. We have the greatest system in the world. It's a little bit sick right now. We need to get it some medication, right?
Absolutely.
We really do, but the ability to get us back on track is there. And so I hope everybody watching this show and listening to this decides to be part of that.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Mr. Hatch. I appreciate you having me on the show. How can people find out more about your campaign?
Our website is electhatch.com. We have, you can get links from there to our Instagram and Facebook and other social media. And I think Twitter, you name it, I think we've got it. But
you got on a TikTok yet? No,
actually, we don't. But someone said I had to dance if I was on TikTok, so I haven't agreed to that yet.
Absolutely, yeah.
You'll see I have a
first time you do, your KSL will pick it up.
Well, if you hurry, at some point somebody's going to tell me to take it down because it's undignified. But I have there's a button on there you can click. I think it says the lighter side, and because I enjoy life. I've been a Mormon bishop 3 times, and my goal in my ward was, I said, particularly with activities, I said, if I wouldn't want to go to it, we're not going to do it.
Absolutely.
And I felt like, your whole life you should be enjoying and having fun. And if you're not, you're doing something wrong. So I've got a little bit of a lighter side. You'll see that there's even a picture of one. There's an old Land Rover running over me.
I saw that on your campaign.
Yeah, which is not very traditional. And the other side is I wear bow ties, and I get a lot of criticism for that. But I've tried cases for years, and we talk to the juries afterwards, and frankly, people like it. And if you don't, there's something wrong with you.
Absolutely. Yeah.
So one person said,
your lapel there. I like your lapel.
Yeah. Well, so what I did is people criticized me for the bow tie. I doubled down, and everybody wears the flag pin, right? Well, you notice mine's a flag bow tie.
Yeah, absolutely.
And so I had one guy come up to me and said, I want to have a politician who has courage, and he goes, it looks like you do, because people have told you not to wear the bow tie. It's not the politically correct thing to do. And you've said, I don't care. This is who I am, and I'm not going to change who I am. And that's one of the things you're going to get with me. I'm not going to change who I am just to get elected.
Absolutely. I think that's something a lot of folks will value. Seriously.
I hope so.
Well, Mr. Hatch, once again, thank you so much for coming on the show. Y'all, make sure you go out and investigate your candidates for office. Make sure you check your voter registration rolls, vote.utah.gov, and keep an eye out because the campaign, the Republican caucus will be coming up the Republican convention will be coming up on April 27th. Thank you so much for tuning in, Wolverines. We really appreciate your time, and God bless you. Bye-bye.